What do you do when your wife punishes you with silence for 30 days, then smirks like she trained you? Do you chase her approval again, or do you quietly collect timestamps, let the building watch, and end the marriage on record without begging once? My name is Dean Kessler, and for most of my adult life I have believed that silence was neutral, a pause between thoughts, a polite space where people cooled down and returned with better words. That belief died in my kitchen on a Tuesday night, not with a scream or a slammed door, but with the soft, deliberate quiet my wife had been feeding me for a month like a strict diet. Paige didn't just stop talking. She removed herself from the basic mechanics of being married while still occupying the same rooms, and she did it with the confidence of someone who thinks punishment counts as communication. She walked past me without looking up, ate without asking if I wanted anything, slept, turned away like I was a stain on the mattress, and moved through our home with the cold precision of a person erasing a name from a document. At first, I tried to treat it like a rough patch, because that is what decent men do when they still believe the other person is decent too. I tried checking in, using gentle questions that offered her a door back into normal life, and each time she answered with nothing, which is a kind of answer that leaves bruises without fingerprints. You can't argue with silence, and you can't prove it happened, and that is why it works so well on people who like reason. Silence turns every day into a test you did not sign up for, and it keeps changing the grading rubric while you are still writing your name at the top of the page. By the second week, the building seemed to notice, which was the part that made my stomach tighten. Our condo wasn't huge, but it was dense, the sort of place where neighbors don't know your last name, yet somehow know your mood. There were polite nods in the lobby, and then fewer nods, and then the kind of eye contact that breaks early, like people have already heard a story and don't want to be caught contradicting it. Paige, meanwhile, looked fine in public, which was the final insult. She smiled for the concierge, made small talk near the mailboxes, and laughed softly in the elevator, and I realized she had not withdrawn from the world. She had withdrawn from me. I made one mistake in that period, which was assuming the problem was emotional rather than tactical. I kept thinking the silence meant she was hurt, and hurt people eventually talk, and if I stayed patient, I could earn the return of normal life. That idea crumbled on day 28, after a weekend where she had spoken exactly 4 words to me, all of them logistical, all of them delivered without eye contact. I was washing a pan when I heard her step into the kitchen, and I did not turn around because I was tired of performing like a man trying to win a prize. She stood behind me long enough for me to feel the weight of her gaze. Then she let out a small, satisfied breath, the kind of sound people make when they watch a trap spring and feel proud of their craftsmanship. I dried my hands, turned, and saw the smirk already formed, smooth and practiced, like she had rehearsed it in a mirror. Her eyes were bright, not with affection, but with the sense of control that comes from watching someone else bend. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't need to. She simply looked at me and delivered the line like a teacher grading a student who finally learned to sit still. She said that now I understood, and she made it clear that this entire month had been a lesson, not a fight, and the worst part was how pleased she was with herself for turning our marriage into a training program. I could have reacted in the usual ways, because the usual ways are easy, and easy reactions are the currency Paige traded in. I could have argued that she was cruel, and she would have called me dramatic. I could have pleaded that we should talk, and she would have acted like I was proving her point. I could have snapped back with something sharp, and she would have smiled wider, because then she could tell the building I was unstable. Paige didn't want resolution. She wanted a story where she was the calm authority and I was the messy correction. So I gave her what she never expected from me, which was agreement without negotiation. I smiled back, not warmly, but cleanly, and I told her I had learned my lesson, because that part was true. Then I told her the rest, the part she could not turn into a game because it had no emotional leverage attached. I said there would be no more marriage for me, that I was done, and I said it in the same tone I would use to confirm a dentist appointment. Paige blinked once, and for a moment her smirk hesitated, like a mask slipping when the actor forgets the next line. The silence that followed was different, because for the first time, it wasn't hers. It was mine, and mine did not beg for applause. I turned back to the sink and finished washing the pan like the conversation had been about groceries. I heard her shift her weight, waiting for me to chase her, waiting for me to correct my mistake by pleading. When I didn't, she left the kitchen with a sharper step than she entered with, and the door to our bedroom closed a fraction louder than necessary. That night I lay awake, not because I missed her voice, but because my brain was finally doing what it should have done at the beginning, which was asking what Paige gained from this. People do not run month-long punishment campaigns for no reason, not unless control itself is the reward, and Paige was too practical to waste energy on mere sport. The smirk was the tell. Smirks belong to people who believe they won something, and I needed to know what exactly she thought she had won. The next morning, I did not announce plans, because announcing plans invites sabotage. I made coffee, checked my emails, and moved through the routine like a man with nothing new in his life. Paige came into the kitchen wearing a robe, her hair damp, her posture relaxed again, as if last night had been a successful training session and the schedule could return to normal. She looked at me briefly, expecting the usual aftershock, the apology, the softening. I gave her none of it. I nodded once and asked if she wanted coffee, because politeness costs less than rage, and it keeps you from giving a manipulator any useful footage. When she left for the day, she did not say where she was going, which was new, but she didn't need to. The silence had already lowered the standard of explanation in our home, and I had been foolish enough to accept that. I watched from the hallway as she stepped into the corridor, then the elevator. A minute later, my phone buzzed with the familiar chime from the doorbell camera app, the one pointed at our own doorway, the only angle I had and the only one I needed. The notification showed that the door had opened, time-stamped, and then closed. And it wasn't Paige. It was the superintendent, Owen Pike, holding a small clipboard, pausing as if he expected someone to answer. I opened the live view on my phone and watched him stand there for a few seconds, then leave. I did not message him, because I did not want my interest logged anywhere except inside my own head. Instead, I took a screenshot of the still frame where the date and time were visible and saved it to a folder I named something boring, something that would never invite curiosity. I didn't know yet what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. Owen did not come to our door randomly. He came because someone requested something, and that someone likely had a reason to keep it quiet. By late afternoon, Paige returned in a better mood than she deserved. She moved through the apartment with a lightness that made my skin prickle, humming quietly as if she had spent the day being praised. She opened the fridge, commented on nothing, and started making dinner, performing normal domesticity like it was a kindness. I watched her hands as she cooked, because hands reveal things faces try to hide. Her movements were efficient, but slightly rushed, like she had a schedule in her head and didn't want to fall behind it. At one point, her phone lit up on the counter, face down, and the lock screen preview flashed just enough to show a notification banner without revealing the full message. I didn't touch the device, and I didn't need to. The preview showed a first name and a single line that mentioned tonight and side door, and then it vanished. Paige's hand moved too quickly toward the phone, and she flipped it over with the casual aggression of someone trying to look casual. She glanced at me to see if I had seen it, and I gave her the same neutral face I give strangers in elevators. After dinner, she disappeared into the bedroom with her phone and closed the door, and I heard her voice for the first time in weeks, low and careful, the voice she had refused to use on me. It wasn't loud enough to catch words, but it wasn't meant for me anyway. It was meant for someone she still considered worth the effort. I stood in the hallway for a moment and felt something clean settle in my chest, not heartbreak, not anger, but clarity. The month of silence had not been a wounded retreat. It had been a smokescreen, a way to keep me uncertain and off balance while she moved pieces around the board. I returned to the living room and sat down with a legal pad, because I needed a place to put facts that did not argue back. At the top, I wrote the date, then I wrote the time of Owen's visit, then the time of the notification I had seen, and I kept my handwriting steady. I did not write feelings. Feelings are the part Paige manipulates. I wrote only what could be anchored to a timestamp, because timestamps are the one language liars cannot charm. When Paige came out later, she looked at the legal pad and asked what I was doing, her voice smooth again, as if she had every right to audit my thoughts. I told her I was making a list for myself, because my memory had been bad lately, and I smiled politely as I said it. She studied me for a second, then shrugged like I was harmless, and that shrug was a mistake she would pay for. She went to bed without another word, and I stayed up long enough to check the doorbell app again, not because I expected a miracle, but because I was done living inside uncertainty. At 11:47 p.m., the doorbell camera caught motion in the corridor, two silhouettes passing our door without stopping. The timestamp sat there like a pin in a map, and I took another still frame, saved it beside the first, and wrote the time on my pad. I did not know who they were, and I did not need to know yet. I only needed to know that Paige's silence had not ended the story. It had only delayed my attention, and now my attention had finally arrived. I put the legal pad away, turned off the light, and walked to bed with the calm of a man who has already left, even if his body is still in the room. Paige slept facing the wall, perfectly comfortable, and I watched her for a moment without hate. Then I looked at the ceiling and realized the month had taught me the only lesson that mattered. If she wanted to treat marriage like a lesson plan, then I would treat the next 30 days like documentation, and I would let the record do what my voice never could. By morning, the apartment felt like a showroom model where nobody lives, clean surfaces, careful spacing, and a quiet that pretends it is peace. Paige moved through it with the kind of relaxed confidence you get when you believe the other person has accepted the rules of your little system. She made coffee without asking me if I wanted any, then left my mug on the counter anyway, like a token offered to keep the story balanced. I took the mug because refusing it would be interpreted as hostility, and hostility was the costume she wanted me to wear. Manipulators love costumes, because costumes make the audience pick a side before the facts arrive. I watched her get dressed in the mirror by accident, which is the only kind of watching you can do without turning yourself into the villain. Her movements were neat and practiced, the way a person moves when they already know what the day is for. She didn't look guilty and she didn't look nervous, and that was important, because innocent people show confusion when the air changes. Paige showed certainty, and certainty usually comes from planning. When she left, she didn't announce where she was going, and she didn't have to, because her silence had trained me to accept less information like it was normal. The door clicked shut behind her, and within seconds, my phone chimed again with the doorbell app notification. I didn't move fast, because speed looks like desperation even when nobody is watching. I picked up the phone, opened the live view, and saw nothing but the empty corridor. The motion alert had been triggered by someone passing, just a blur at the edge, but the timestamp was crisp. I wrote it down on the legal pad, because the pad was now the only marriage counselor we had, and it never took sides. I didn't tell myself a story about what the timestamp meant, because stories are how people survive pain, and survival stories are often wrong. I simply made a small column on the page labeled Movement Alerts and added the time. Then I labeled another column labeled Page Exit and wrote the time she left. Next to those, I wrote a simple note: side corridor motion within 1 minute. No adjectives, no conclusions, just a pattern starting to form like a stain. At lunch, I walked down to the mailroom the way I always did, because routine is camouflage and also a useful trap. The lobby smelled faintly of wet rubber from yesterday's rain, and the floor mat near the elevators was still damp, holding little footprints like a map no one meant to draw. The concierge gave me a nod that stopped early, as if he was doing the motion for duty rather than for warmth. That tiny change told me something already mattered, even if nobody said it out loud. Buildings have their own circulatory system, and gossip moves through it faster than heat. Near the mailboxes, Mina Harper stood with a stack of envelopes, flipping through them like she was counting the ways life stays annoying. Mina was the kind of neighbor who never smiled too wide and never asked questions that would force her into emotional labor. She and Paige had exchanged pleasant words over the years, but they weren't friends. That mattered, because friends will lie for each other without even noticing. Mina would lie only if it benefited her, and I had a feeling she preferred quiet more than loyalty. She looked up, saw me, and her eyes shifted slightly toward the elevator doors before returning to my face. That flicker was small, but it was a tell, the kind of reflex people have when they want to check whether someone else is watching. I kept my expression neutral and asked her if the building had been louder lately, because that question was harmless and sounded like small talk. Mina exhaled like she had been waiting for someone else to say it first. She told me the HOA board had been active again, sending reminders and warnings like the building was a school and everyone was failing. I nodded, pretending this was just another boring conversation about shared walls and petty rules. Then I asked, still casual, whether she had seen Paige coming in late recently, because sometimes I sleep through the hallway noise. I phrased it like a logistical question, not an accusation, because accusations make people back away. Mina didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her letters, then back up, and there was a brief hesitation that told me she knew more than she wanted to carry. She said she had noticed movement by the side entrance around midnight a few times, and she said it in a tone that suggested she hated noticing. She didn't say Paige's name at first, which was careful, but she also didn't deny the implication. I didn't push for details because pushing creates a story where I am interrogating neighbors, and I refused that role. I just asked whether it sounded like one person or more than one, and she said it sounded like two sets of steps, close together, then a pause, then the door again. She did not claim to see faces. She gave me what she could offer without putting her name on a fight. I thanked her and walked away before she could regret it. In the elevator, I felt the old impulse to rage, because rage is the brain's cheap way of pretending you have power. I let the impulse pass like a car on a street I was no longer crossing. Power would come from records, not from volume. When I reached our floor, I walked down the hall at the same pace I always did, and I noticed the camera above the emergency stairwell door, the one pointed at the public area. I didn't stare at it. I didn't need it. I had my own doorway camera, and I had Mina's one-sentence observation. That was enough to start building an evidence ledger without turning myself into a man hunting for illegal angles. Back inside, I opened the doorbell app and scrolled through the log with the calm patience of someone reading weather reports. The motion alerts were there, each one marked with date and time, and I compared them to the times Paige had been absent or oddly quiet. One by one, the pattern tightened. There were nights where she claimed she had been asleep early, yet the corridor motion showed activity around our door. There were evenings where she claimed she took a long walk to clear her head, and the timestamps suggested the walk ended at a side entrance rather than at our front door. If you look at enough timestamps, you start to feel the lie's skeleton. I wrote Mina's observation on the legal pad as a single clean line, then I wrote neutral witness unnamed. I didn't need to brand her name in ink. I didn't want her dragged into this. The point was corroboration, not a trial. I added a note that the side entrance was involved because that detail would matter later when someone tried to claim it was all in my imagination. Imagination does not produce consistent door patterns. That evening, Paige came home with a lightness that made my jaw tighten. She hummed while taking off her shoes, and she tossed her keys into the bowl like nothing in her life carried weight. Then she asked, with false casualness, whether I seemed calmer lately. The question wasn't curiosity, it was an inspection. She wanted to confirm that her month-long punishment had worked, that I had learned to shrink. Her smirk from yesterday still sat in my memory like a stain I couldn't scrub out. I told her I was sleeping better, which was a lie. But it was a harmless lie, and it kept her from seeing the real shift. She smiled, satisfied, and moved into the kitchen. As she cooked, she kept her phone close, face down, and she checked it with quick glances when she thought I wasn't watching. I wasn't watching her like a jealous husband. I was watching the rhythm of her attention, because attention reveals what people value. Paige valued that phone now more than she valued her performance in front of me. A few minutes later, the phone lit again on the counter, and the lock screen preview flashed a banner long enough for my eyes to catch the one thing I needed. It was not the full message. It was not a name I recognized clearly. It was a partial line that included a time and the words, "side door," and the time was earlier than midnight. Paige's hand snapped toward the phone and flipped it over with practice speed. Then she looked at me like she was watching to see whether I would flinch. I didn't flinch. I took a sip of water and asked if we were low on dish soap, because nothing disarms a manipulator faster than an uninteresting question. She relaxed a fraction, because she still believed I was slow. She answered about dish soap, and her voice was smooth again, domestic, normal. The second she turned away, I took my legal pad and wrote the exact time I saw the preview flash. I didn't write the words. I wrote only the time, because the time was the anchor. Then I wrote a note. Lock screen banner mentions side door. That was enough. The details would come later if they had to, but the time would never change. After dinner, Paige announced she needed air, which was a new variation of the old cover story, and she grabbed her phone. She said she would be back soon, as if offering me the courtesy of expectation. I nodded without looking up, and she left. When the door closed, the apartment became quieter than it already was, and I waited, not in suspense, but with the calm curiosity of a man testing a theory. I opened the doorbell app and watched the live feed, letting it sit like a silent witness. At 8:42 p.m., motion triggered in the corridor. The feed showed Paige leaving, but not by our door. It showed her turning toward the side hallway, the one that leads to the service stairwell and the secondary exit. The camera angle didn't capture her face fully, but it didn't need to. The timestamp captured her route. I took a still frame and saved it, then I wrote 8:42 p.m. side hall departure on the pad. A few minutes later, another motion alert triggered, and the feed caught a man's shoulder and messenger bag moving past our doorway toward the same side hall. The camera didn't show his face clearly, but it showed his direction and his timing, and timing is the only thing that matters when someone tries to claim coincidence. I saved that still frame too. Then I sat back and waited. I didn't follow. Following turns you into the story, and Paige was building a story where I would be the unstable husband who couldn't let go. I was not giving her that. I stayed home, inside the lawful boundaries of my own camera and my own notes, and I let her movements speak for themselves. Paige returned at 10:05 p.m. through our front door, breathing slightly faster, cheeks faintly flushed like she had been warm. She told me the air helped her head clear, and the line was delivered like a script, clean and rehearsed. I nodded, asked if she wanted tea, and she looked at me with that faint predatory satisfaction again, like she was watching me accept crumbs. Then she went to the bathroom and locked the door, and I heard her voice, low again, speaking to someone softly. I sat on the couch and looked at my legal pad, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a kind of relief that surprised me. Relief is not always joy. Sometimes it is simply the moment you stop wondering whether you are crazy. The month of silence had been designed to make me doubt my own reality, to make me chase her approval like a dog chasing a moving hand. But reality was now on paper, in timestamps, in simple entries that could not be gaslit. Paige could smirk all she wanted. Smirks don't erase logs. Before bed, I labeled a folder on my phone with the dullest name I could think of and placed the still frames inside it. Then, I wrote a single line at the bottom of the legal pad page, a promise to myself, not a threat to anyone else. I wrote that I would not confront privately, and I would not argue in the hallway, and I would not plead in the kitchen. I would collect small truths until the people who loved minutes and rules were forced to touch them. Then I turned off the light and lay down beside the woman who had tried to train me, knowing that the next phase would not be louder. It would be cleaner, colder, and impossible to misquote. The next day, I woke with the dull ache behind my eyes that comes from sleeping in the same room as a problem you refuse to name out loud. Paige was already up, moving quietly through the apartment like she owned the air, and I was borrowing it. She poured herself coffee, opened her phone, and smiled at whatever lived behind the screen. That smile was not for me and not for the life we shared. It was a private reward, and it made my hands go cold. Then she noticed me watching, and the smile faded into neutrality as if someone had flipped a switch. She asked if I had plans later, and the tone was casual, which meant it was not casual. It was an inventory check, a way to measure whether the house would be empty at the right time. I told her I had errands and meetings because the truth was none of her business anymore, and because I wanted her to assume I was busy and harmless. She nodded, and the nod said she had already written the day's script, and my line had not surprised her. When she left, she used the side hallway again, and I caught it in the doorbell log without needing to stand at the peephole like a desperate man. I did not follow, and I did not call, and I did not text. I went to work, did my job, smiled at the right people, and kept my voice steady. The revenge Paige expected from me was emotional, messy, and loud. She expected me to break. I was not breaking. I was documenting. That difference would matter later, when someone tried to frame me as the unstable one, because unstable men do not keep clean ledgers. Unstable men shout and forget details. I was starting to remember details like my life depended on them, because in a way it did. By midday, my phone chimed with a notification that had nothing to do with the doorbell. It was a simple merchant alert from my bank app, the kind of alert I set up years ago because I like knowing when money moves. The transaction was small and looked ordinary, a dues payment, but the timing hit me like a cold thumb pressed into a bruise. The payment posted during the window, Paige claimed she was clearing her head, and the payee name matched the HOA Association account that handles access privileges and fines. Paige had been feeding me silence while quietly paying into the system that polices our building, and that told me this was not just romance or boredom. This was politics. I saved the screenshot, then I wrote the time down beside the other timestamps. I made the note simple: merchant alert, HOA dues, time matches side exit. The page was becoming a map of her choices, and maps have a way of making people feel trapped even when the walls are still open. I did not know yet what the dues payment meant in the larger game, but I knew Conrad Vale was the sort of man who loved small levers. He was the HOA president, and that role attracts a specific breed, people who cannot command the world, so they command a building. When I got home, the lobby felt different again. There were more eyes, more pauses, more people who became suddenly interested in their phones the second I looked their way. Even the elevator felt colder, like the air had been instructed to behave. Paige had been talking somewhere because silence in private is often paired with noise in public. She was building a narrative that could live without evidence, because narratives do not need proof when the crowd wants entertainment. Mina was in the mailroom again, and this time she looked annoyed before she even saw me. She held a small package against her hip, and the label was torn, as if the building had handled it roughly. When she noticed me, she didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply said that people were asking weird questions lately, and that the HOA group chat had turned into a messy stage. I asked what kind of questions, keeping my tone flat. Mina's eyes narrowed slightly, and she said Conrad had been hinting that some residents were experiencing domestic disruption that could affect community safety. That wording was so carefully vague it almost made me laugh. Community safety, domestic disruption. Those phrases exist to imply danger without claiming facts. They also exist to justify HOA pressure without admitting it is personal. Mina told me she hated it because it made the hallways feel tense, and she asked, without asking directly, whether Paige and I were okay. I told her we were not okay, but I did not offer details, because details are gifts in a building full of hungry mouths. I said we were handling it privately, and the private part sounded like a lie even to me. Mina looked away toward the elevator again, then leaned closer like she was deciding whether I deserved a small mercy. She said she had seen Paige with someone near the side entrance earlier this week, not face-to-face close, but close enough that it looked intentional. Mina did not describe the man beyond general shape and posture, because she was careful, but she said he carried himself like he belonged in the building's business. That could mean anything, but my mind immediately went to Owen Pike, the superintendent, and then to Conrad, and then to the idea that Paige's affair, if that's what this was, might be tied to the building's power structure. That possibility made my stomach shift. I asked Mina one question, and I made it sound as boring as possible. I asked whether she had noticed what time that was. Mina hesitated, then said it was around 8:40 p.m., because she had been waiting for a delivery, and she remembered checking her phone. That time matched the doorbell log from the night Paige took air. I felt the pieces align quietly, and I did not let my face show it. I thanked Mina for telling me, and I asked her not to get pulled into anything. She nodded like she was relieved I had not asked more. Back upstairs, I checked the doorbell log again and matched Mina's time to the still frames I had saved. The man with the messenger bag passed our door at 8:46 p.m. and went toward the side hall. 6 minutes later, the motion alert triggered again, and the feed caught two figures returning, one of them Paige. The angle was poor, but the timing was clean. Two people moved together toward our corridor after being absent at the same time. It was not proof of intimacy, but it was proof of coordination, and coordination is the thing people deny first. That night, Paige came home later than usual, and she looked refreshed in a way that had nothing to do with air. She greeted me with a small smile that did not reach her eyes, and she asked whether I had seen the new HOA notice on the lobby board. The question landed like a coin dropped into a cup. She wanted to measure my awareness. I told her I had not looked because I had been busy, and she seemed pleased by that answer. Then she started talking, casually, about community standards and neighbor respect, and I realized she was laying groundwork. She was making sure that when things eventually exploded, the building would already believe her version. I waited until she was in the shower. Then I took my legal pad out again and wrote down her new talking points. I wrote community standards and respect and safety in the margin, because those were the words Conrad used too. Paige was not inventing this language on her own. She was borrowing it from someone who understood how to weaponize systems. That was my first major shift from suspicion to certainty. This was not just a private betrayal. It was a coordinated use of silence and community pressure to control me and pre-frame my reaction. The next step had to be taken carefully, because one wrong move would turn the building into a chorus against me. I needed a record outside my head, something that could survive gossip. I could not hack anything, and I would not. I would not install trackers or plant devices, because that would be a gift to Paige. I could only use what was mine: my doorbell camera, my bank alerts, my observations, and the neutral witness line Mina had offered. That was enough, if I used it the right way. The following morning, I requested a copy of the HOA meeting agenda from the lobby board, taking a photo of it like any normal resident might. I didn't hover. I didn't ask the concierge any questions. I took a clean picture, time-stamped, and walked away. Then I searched my email for HOA notices and saved the subject line of the most recent reminder, because it showed Conrad's tone and the date. These were small pieces, but small pieces are how you build a case that feels inevitable rather than theatrical. In the afternoon, I saw Owen Pike in the hallway outside the service closet, and he greeted me with a polite nod that felt strained. Owen was a quiet man who liked tools and routine, and he hated being in the center of anyone's story. I did not accuse him. I did not ask him about Paige. I simply asked whether the side door had been sticking lately, because I had noticed it opening more often. Owen's eyes flickered, and he said it had been fine, but his voice was too quick, too clean, like he was stepping around something on the floor. I thanked him and walked away, because that was all I needed. If Owen was uncomfortable, it meant he knew there was something to know. If he was uncomfortable and Conrad was confident, it meant Conrad was using him or pressuring him. Either way, it pointed back to the same place, the HOA boardroom, where minutes were typed and narratives became official. That night, Paige said she was going to meet a friend for coffee, and she said it with the lazy confidence of someone who believes the lie is already accepted. I nodded, told her to have fun, and watched her take the side hall again. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my legal pad until the urge to chase died completely. I did not need to see her with another man to know what was happening. I needed to show that her silence was a tool, her movements were coordinated, and her story was being built through community channels. When Paige came back, she tried to act like everything was normal, and she even attempted a small joke, the kind couples use to pretend they still like each other. I smiled politely, because polite smiles are camouflage, and I gave her no reaction she could take into the group chat. Then I went to bed and stared at the ceiling again, feeling the cold clarity settle deeper. By the end of that week, my ledger contained enough timestamps to draw a straight line from the month of silence to the building's shifting attitude. Paige had been training me privately while staging me publicly, and she had help. Mina's observation was the first confirmation, and the merchant alert was the second. I had the bones of a story now, and it was not a story about love. It was a story about power, and I was done being the subject of someone else's lesson plan. By the time the weekend arrived, the building had stopped pretending it didn't care, and it started behaving like it had elected itself judge and jury. The lobby felt like a small courtroom where everyone had already read the gossip, and they were waiting to see which actor forgot their lines first. The concierge still nodded, but the nod had become procedural, like a stamp applied to a form without reading it. Even the elevators seemed slower, as if they were giving people extra seconds to stare without being caught. Paige leaned into it with the confidence of someone who believes optics are the same thing as truth. She dressed like she was headed to a brunch with people she wanted to impress, and she left the apartment with a soft hum, which was her way of declaring she slept fine. She didn't ask whether I wanted to come with her, because she did not want me near her stage. That was the whole point of the month-long silence, not distance, but choreography. She was shaping the audience, while I was still standing under the spotlight, wondering why the lights were so hot. I stayed inside long enough to check the doorbell log again, because routines are the only honest witnesses in a building full of amateur storytellers. The motion alerts had become predictable, which was the dangerous part, because predictable means planned. Around 8:40 p.m., on 2 separate weeknights, Paige disappeared through the side corridor, and a second figure followed within minutes. Around 10:05 p.m., she reappeared through the front door with a face that looked too satisfied for someone who only took air. The pattern wasn't romantic, not in the way that would make a novelist happy, but it was logistical, the kind of pattern that belongs to people trying to avoid certain eyes. I stopped calling it the affair in my head, because affair is emotional, and emotion was Paige's favorite resource. I started calling it the operation, because it behaved like one. You don't run an operation without a purpose. And you don't involve building leadership unless you want to weaponize the building itself. Paige wasn't only cheating on me. She was using me as a prop in a larger play, and I had a feeling the climax was going to happen somewhere with minutes and rules. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed again with another merchant alert, and this one was more interesting than the HOA dues. It was a charge from a local print shop, modest but specific, the kind of place you use when you want paper in your hands fast. Paige's name wasn't on the transaction because it was my account, which meant either she used the shared card without caring, or she used it because she knew I would notice and still do nothing. That second possibility was the one that made my mouth go dry. People who test boundaries do it in small, deniable ways first, then they escalate when you keep swallowing it. I saved the alert screenshot, then I wrote the time and the payee name on the legal pad. I added a line underneath it, printed materials, likely HOA related. I didn't know that for a fact, but the coincidence was too neat, and neat coincidences are usually manufactured. Then I checked the doorbell log for that time window and saw Paige passing toward the side hall minutes after the transaction posted. The operation had a paper component now, and paper means a plan that wants to be seen. That evening, Paige came home with a thin smile and a new kind of friendliness, the kind she used when she wanted to place something into the air and have it land where she aimed. She asked whether I had noticed how tense the building felt, and the question sounded sympathetic until you heard the hook underneath it. She was inviting me to agree that something was wrong, so she could later tell people I admitted it. She was trying to get me to sign her story with my own mouth. I told her the building was the building, and I kept my tone bored. I asked whether she wanted dinner, and I focused on the fridge like I was deciding between leftovers and regret. Paige watched me for a moment with narrowed eyes, like she was checking whether I had learned to be quiet in the way she preferred. Then she made a small sound of annoyance and walked away, because bored men ruin plots. Bored men don't give the audience the catharsis they came for. 2 hours later, the email arrived, and it wasn't subtle. The subject line announced an HOA incident review scheduled for the following week, with mandatory attendance for involved residents. It used vague language, carefully legal without being truly legal, which was exactly Conrad Vale's style. He didn't want to accuse anyone directly, because direct accusations require proof. He wanted to imply disruption, because implication creates fear without responsibility. I opened the email on my phone, took a screenshot of the header and the date, then I printed it from my own printer and signed the back with the day's date, because I had learned that paper has a gravity digital never gets. The word mandatory sat there like a threat dressed as policy, and I could already imagine Paige forwarding it to someone else with a sweet note about how hard it was living with a man who made the building uncomfortable. Paige wasn't just smirking anymore. She was moving toward formal pressure. In the morning, I went downstairs and stood by the lobby board, where HOA notices were pinned. There was a new sheet of paper there, fresh, aligned carefully, entitled Community Conduct Reminder. It was the sort of notice you write when you want to control behavior without naming names, because naming names risks defamation. It mentioned noise, safety, and respectful communication, and it encouraged residents to report concerns to the board. Report concerns. That was how you recruit people into surveillance without calling it surveillance. You make it sound like virtue. I took a photo of the notice with the timestamp visible. Then I stepped back and watched the hallway reflection in the glass. A woman from the 4th floor approached, read it, and looked up at me with a quick, curious stare. She didn't speak, but her eyes did, and her eyes asked whether I was the reason the paper existed. I gave her a polite nod and walked away, because I refused to stand there looking defensive. Defensive men look guilty in places like this. On my way back up, I ran into Owen Pike near the service stairwell again. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from being trapped between people with power and people with anger. I kept my face neutral and asked whether there had been any changes to side entrance access lately, because the door seemed to be used more. Owen hesitated, then said the board had discussed tightening procedures, and he said it in a tone that suggested the phrase made him sick. Tightening procedures is what people say when they want to lock someone out without admitting it is personal. I didn't press him, because pressing him would make him retreat into Conrad's arms, and Conrad would feed him a story about my instability. Instead, I thanked Owen for the information and walked away, letting him keep his dignity. As I reached my door, my phone buzzed with a doorbell motion alert, and when I opened it, I saw Paige's face close to the camera as she stepped out, dressed again like she was heading to an event. She wasn't leaving through the front route. She turned toward the side hall with purpose, and the timestamp sat there like a signature. I saved the still frame, then I created a simple evidence ledger on paper, just as I had promised myself. I drew 5 columns with a ruler, because straight lines make messy truths easier to hold. Date, time, event, source, notes. Then I filled in the most recent entries. HOA email header, lobby notice photo, merchant alert from print shop, side hall exit frame, and Mina's neutral observation summarized as one sentence. I didn't add commentary. I didn't add emotion. I wrote only facts that could survive someone else's opinion. That evening, Paige returned through the front door with a new scent on her, subtle but unfamiliar, and she looked satisfied in the way people look when they think they have arranged the world properly. She asked, almost sweetly, whether I planned to attend the HOA review meeting. She already knew the answer because the email said mandatory, but she wanted to watch how I reacted. This was her new version of the month-long silence, not absence of words, but words used like needles. I told her I would attend because I follow rules, and I said it like I was talking about recycling. Paige's smile twitched at the edges because she wanted fear, and she got calm. Then she told me, with casual contempt disguised as advice, that I should keep my temper under control in public. That line landed like a small shove. She was planting the idea that I had a temper, so the audience would look for it. I nodded, and I asked whether she wanted to practice respectful communication together because the lobby notice sounded serious. I kept my tone light, but the sarcasm was there, thin and sharp. Paige's eyes flashed, and for a second I saw real anger, not performance anger, but the private kind that shows when someone feels their control slipping. Then she turned away and said nothing, because silence is her favorite tool when she can't win on words. After she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and spread the evidence ledger beside the legal pad. I compared each entry, checked the sequence, and asked myself one question that mattered more than whether she was sleeping with someone. I asked myself what the HOA review meeting was actually for. If Conrad wanted to punish me, he would do it through access codes, fines, and violations. If Paige wanted to punish me, she would do it through reputation, whispers, and the careful suggestion that I was unsafe. And if they wanted to do it together, they needed a public record that justified whatever came next. That was the moment I realized the operation wasn't only about cheating. Cheating was just the bait, the thing that would make me react and look messy. The real engine was control of the building narrative, because once the building believes you are the problem, every rule becomes a weapon. I looked at the ledger, then at the empty chair across from me, and I imagined it filled with people holding polite faces while they watched me for signs of anger. Paige would sit there, calm, smirking inside, waiting for me to prove her story. I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't need to. I wasn't dreaming anymore. I was planning not with tricks or illegal shortcuts, but with the only thing that terrifies people like Conrad and Paige. I was planning to walk into their meeting with clean documents, steady eyes, and a silence that wasn't surrender. It was the kind of silence that forces other people to speak first, and when they speak first, they make mistakes. On the morning of the HOA incident review, Paige woke up early and moved with the focused calm of someone dressing for a hearing, not a meeting, and she did it without acknowledging the word hearing. She wore neutral colors, nothing flashy, nothing that could be described as provocative. and she pinned her hair back in a way that made her look responsible, the kind of responsible that people trust by reflex. She didn't speak to me, but she didn't need to, because the silence had already been replaced by something worse, a shared understanding that the next room would have witnesses. I ate slowly, not because I was hungry, but because I wanted my body to practice calm before it mattered. In my head, I repeated the same rule I had written on paper. No private confrontation, no emotional bargaining, no scene in the hallway. I had watched Paige build a story for weeks, and I had watched Conrad Vale pump it through the building's veins with notices and vague warnings. Now they wanted the moment where I snapped, because snapping would validate everything they had implied without ever proving. The folder I carried wasn't dramatic, and that was the point. It was a plain sleeve with a simple label, nothing that looked like a stunt, because stunts invite defensiveness, and defensiveness invites sympathy for the other side. Inside the sleeve were clean, boring truths, screenshots of the HOA email header and schedule, a photo of the lobby notice with the date visible, merchant alerts from my own account, and still frames from the doorbell camera showing Paige using the side corridor at the same time she claimed she was doing something else. None of it was illegal to collect, none of it required cleverness, and none of it depended on a single explosive smoking gun. It was death by 1,000 truths, the slow collapse of a narrative that can't survive timestamps. We rode the elevator down together like strangers sharing a brief ride. Paige stared at the numbers, and I stared at the tiny scuffs on the mirror where other residents had leaned and waited. When the doors opened, the lobby was busy in that quiet, staged way, as if people had coordinated their errands to happen at the same time. A few faces turned toward us, then away, then back again, because curiosity always circles when it thinks it has permission. The meeting was scheduled in the small community room off the lobby, the one normally used for board updates and holiday sign-up sheets, the one with folding chairs and a cheap projector mounted high like an eye. Conrad Vale stood near a table at the front, wearing a blazer that made him look like a man who loved the word policy. His smile was narrow and controlled, the kind that doesn't welcome people, only manages them. 2 other board members sat nearby, both of them looking like they would rather be anywhere else, and Owen Pike hovered near the back with a clipboard, shoulders tight, like a man holding a live wire. Paige stepped in first and greeted Conrad with the right amount of warmth, careful enough to look friendly but not intimate. Conrad greeted her with the familiar authority tone, the one he used when he wanted to sound neutral while directing the room. Then Paige took a seat near the front, angled slightly toward the board, her posture open, her hands relaxed in her lap like she was attending a lecture. She looked like a person who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. I sat 2 rows behind her, close enough to be seen, but far enough to avoid looking like I was hovering. I didn't greet Conrad, because greetings can be framed as disrespect if they choose, and silence can be framed as guilt if they choose, so I picked the middle path. I nodded once, small and polite, and waited. Conrad began with a speech that sounded like it had been copied from a template, then customized with just enough implication to make it personal. He spoke about community safety, respectful behavior, and resident comfort, and he never once said my name in the first minute because he wanted the room to lean forward on its own. He said the board had received concerns, and he said they were obligated to address them, and he said the meeting would be documented. Documented. That word landed on the room like a gavel. Then he turned the attention toward domestic disruption and hallway discomfort, and he finally used my name with a practiced neutrality that was supposed to sound fair. He asked me to describe what had been happening at home, and the request was framed like a chance for me to defend myself, which was the first trap. Defending yourself from vague accusations is how you make them feel real, because the audience hears the accusation and the defense as equal facts. Paige sat still, looking mildly concerned, the perfect victim shape. I kept my voice even and told Conrad that my marriage had been strained, and that strain had not involved violence, threats, or disturbances in the hallway. I did not say Paige's name in that sentence, because naming her would signal conflict, and conflict would be edited into the story as my aggression. I said the only consistent disturbance had been an increase in unauthorized side corridor traffic that seemed to align with recent board messaging and access discussions. The phrase unauthorized side corridor traffic was deliberate, because it shifted the frame from my marriage to building operations, where Conrad's hands were already visible. Conrad's smile tightened, just slightly, and he asked what I meant. He said the board did not monitor personal comings and goings, and his tone implied I was paranoid. Paranoid was the second trap, because paranoia is a cousin of instability, and instability is the costume Paige wanted me to wear. I nodded once and said I understood. Then I asked whether the board had recently discussed tightening side entrance procedures and access codes. I asked it as a question of policy, not emotion, and the room heard policy language and leaned in again. One of the board members glanced at Owen. Owen's jaw flexed, and he looked down at his clipboard like it contained prayers. Conrad hesitated for a fraction too long, and the hesitation was the only crack I needed. He confirmed that side entrance procedure had been mentioned, then quickly pivoted back to resident concerns, like procedure was irrelevant. That pivot gave me permission to do the one thing Paige and Conrad could not fully control. I opened my sleeve and slid a single page across the table, not a stack, not a dramatic binder, just one printed screenshot of the HOA email header with the mandatory incident review, subject line, and date. I kept my hand steady and my face neutral. I said I wanted the minutes to reflect that the board escalated to mandatory language without any specific documented incident provided to me beforehand. I did not accuse. I requested record accuracy. Conrad's eyes flicked down to the paper, then up to me, and I could feel the room's attention shift. People get bored of vague stories. They wake up for documents. Paige's posture changed slightly, a shoulder tightening, as if she had felt the floor move under her feet. Conrad asked why I was making it so formal, and the question was meant to shame me into emotion. I told him I wasn't making anything formal, because the board had already done that in writing. He tried a softer approach then, asking whether I had been argumentative with Paige, whether I had raised my voice, whether I had made her feel unsafe. The questions came like a sequence designed to corner me into denying, and denial would still put the words unsafe and my name in the same air. I didn't deny. I reframed. I said I had been quiet, and I said my quietness began after a month of deliberate silent treatment, which I described as an ongoing pattern of emotional withholding. Emotional withholding is a phrase people recognize now, and it lands differently than, "we had a bad month." Paige shifted in her chair and looked back at me with a careful expression that tried to communicate surprise without anger. She wanted to look like she hadn't planned anything. Conrad watched her reaction as if it was evidence. Then he asked why I hadn't simply spoken to her privately like an adult. That was another trap, because private confrontation is where Paige could gaslight, cry, and claim I intimidated her, all without witnesses. I said I had tried, and that the silence had not been a cooling-off period but a control tactic, confirmed by the statement she made afterward. I didn't repeat her exact words because direct quoting would sound petty, but I paraphrased cleanly. I said she had treated the month as a lesson I had learned, and she had expressed satisfaction about that. Then I stopped talking. I let the room sit with the idea that a marriage had been turned into a training exercise. Paige finally spoke, and the sound of her voice in public was smooth, practiced, and quiet enough to look reasonable. She said she had needed space, and she said my behavior had become cold, and she implied I was punishing her now. The word punishing was chosen carefully, because it painted her as the one enduring cruelty. Conrad nodded along, because he liked narratives where he could play rescuer. I waited for Paige to finish. Then I slid a second page forward. Again, just one page, not a stack, because stacks look like obsession. The page was a printed merchant alert from my bank app showing the print shop charge with date and time visible. I explained calmly that during the period she claimed she was taking space, there were shared account charges for printing, HOA dues, timing anomalies, and side entrance patterns visible on my own doorbell camera. I said I was not presenting this as a marital complaint. I was presenting it as evidence that a personal conflict had been blended into HOA procedure, which raised a conflict of interest concern. Conrad's face hardened for a second, and the board members looked at each other like people who had just realized the meeting might become inconvenient for them. Paige's expression stayed controlled, but her eyes sharpened, and I could see she was recalculating. Her plan depended on me reacting emotionally. I was reacting administratively, and administrative reactions move faster in systems like this, because systems respect paper more than pain. Conrad tried to shut it down by saying the board didn't adjudicate personal disputes. I agreed. Then I asked him why the board had invited Paige's presence as the primary concerned resident, while also discussing access tightening in the same time frame. I asked whether any board member had personal contact with Paige outside official channels during that month. The room went still, because the question wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, and procedural questions are harder to dismiss without sounding guilty. Owen's eyes lifted, and for a brief moment he looked like he wanted to speak. Then he didn't. Conrad noticed that hesitation and shot Owen a warning look, subtle but clear. That look was its own kind of admission, and it told me I was right about one thing. Paige did not run this operation alone. Conrad ended the meeting early with a stiff announcement about reviewing the materials, and he said the board would follow up in writing. Paige stood up quickly, a fraction too quickly, and she turned toward me with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wanted to say something cutting, something that would restore her control. Instead, she said we would talk at home, and the phrase home sounded like a threat. I gathered my sleeve, nodded once to the room, and walked out without looking back at her. In the lobby, I could feel eyes on my shoulders, but the eyes felt different now, less sure, more curious. Curiosity is a crack in loyalty, and cracks are where truths spread. I stepped into the elevator alone, and as the doors closed, my phone buzzed with a doorbell motion alert from upstairs. Someone was at our door. The timing was too perfect to be random, and I knew it before the elevator even moved. Paige had told me we would talk at home, and now someone was already there, arriving at my doorway while she was still in the lobby behind me. I stared at the notification and felt something cold settle under my ribs, not fear, but recognition. The operation was responding to pressure, and when an operation responds, it usually escalates. The elevator ride felt longer than it should, like the building had learned suspense from Paige and decided to participate. My phone kept vibrating with the same motion alert, as if the camera upstairs was tapping me on the shoulder and saying there was an audience waiting. I watched the tiny thumbnail on the notification, a blurred figure near my doorway, and I hated how ordinary it looked. Nothing dramatic, no obvious threat, just a person standing in a hall like they belonged there. When the elevator opened on my floor, the corridor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something metallic underneath, like a penny warmed in a fist. I walked at the same pace I always did, because speed looks like panic, and panic is what people translate into guilt. The doorbell app showed the visitor still there, and the live feed caught a man shifting his weight, glancing down the hall, then back at my door. He carried a thin envelope and a clipboard, like someone cosplaying responsibility. I reached my door, opened it, and kept my face neutral. The man turned toward me with a practiced smile that didn't touch his eyes. He introduced himself as a courier for the HOA board, which was a sentence designed to sound official without carrying the weight of actual law. He said he needed to hand-deliver a notice and collect my acknowledgement signature. The clipboard angled toward me like a polite spear. I asked what the notice was about, and he said it was a community conduct matter that required my immediate attention. Community conduct again, the phrase Conrad liked because it could mean anything and accuse nothing. I told him I would accept the notice, but I would not sign anything in my hallway. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't argue. I simply said that any acknowledgement would be in writing after review, because that is what responsible adults do when handed paperwork by strangers. The courier's smile flickered, just slightly, and he tried a softer tone. He said signing was standard procedure, and refusing could be recorded as non-compliance. I looked at him and said recording was fine, because I also kept records. Then I took the envelope, stepped back, and closed my door without giving him a second chance to escalate. The latch clicked, and the hallway went quiet again, but I could feel the tension on the other side of the wood, like the building itself was leaning in to listen. I placed the envelope on the kitchen table, took a photo of it beside my phone with the time visible, and only then did I open it. Inside was a thick printed packet labeled Notice of Violation and Request to Cure. The language was clean, polished, and careful, the kind of language that pretends it is neutral while guiding the reader to one conclusion. It alleged repeated disturbances, aggressive behavior, and intimidation of another resident. It referenced the incident review meeting I had just attended, and it suggested my ongoing conduct created an unsafe environment. Unsafe. There it was again, the word Paige wanted glued to my name like gum on a shoe. There was also a second page titled Incident Summary, and the bottom half contained a short paragraph marked Complainant Statement. Under that paragraph was a signature line with my name typed beneath it, followed by handwriting that was not mine. It looked like an attempt at my signature, close enough to fool someone who wanted to be fooled, but wrong in the small ways that matter. The angle was off. The pressure was inconsistent. The loops were theatrical. Whoever wrote it thought signatures were a performance rather than muscle memory. For a full minute I just stared at it, feeling that cold clarity tighten inside my chest. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was fabrication in a formal wrapper. Paige and Conrad weren't simply trying to control the building's mood. They were trying to build a written record that could justify consequences, and they were willing to manufacture my participation to make it look cleaner. It was the kind of move people make when they believe the room will never demand a real chain of custody. I didn't touch the signature line again. I took a photo of the page where the false signature appeared, then I flipped to the back and found a page listing supporting observations. It included vague references to late-night arguments, raised voices, and resident discomfort in shared spaces. No dates, no times, no specific incidents, just a fog bank of accusation meant to make a reader fill in the blanks with their own fears. Then I saw the witness list. One name was missing because it wasn't a name, just security contractor, and that detail made my mouth go dry. A security contractor meant Conrad had brought in outside muscle, not to harm anyone, but to intimidate, to stand around looking official, to reinforce the vibe of danger. It also meant there were invoices somewhere, payments, and paper trails that would not appreciate being questioned. I set the packet down, opened my legal pad, and wrote a single line that felt like a spine locking into place. Forged signature attempt on HOA complaint packet. Then I wrote the time and date. Then I wrote the courier description in plain terms. Male, mid-30s, clipboard, HOA courier, refused to identify employer beyond board. No insults, no guesses, just a record. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was Paige calling from somewhere in the building. I watched the screen light up with her name, and I let it ring until it stopped. I knew what she would say, because she was predictable when she felt control slipping. She would ask if I signed. She would ask if I planned to fight. She would ask in a sweet tone that allowed her to claim she was only trying to help. And if I spoke, she would have a quote to spread. Instead, I scrolled through my doorbell log again and found the clip of the courier arriving. The camera caught him at my door, the envelope visible, the timestamp clean. I saved a still frame where the envelope label could be seen faintly. Then I saved the motion log that showed exactly how long he waited. If anyone later claimed I refused to accept notice, I could show I accepted it, and I could show I declined to sign in the hallway. That distinction mattered, because refusal could be twisted into non-compliance, and non-compliance is how buildings justify escalation. When Paige finally returned, she didn't come in like a wife. She came in like a supervisor checking whether a task had been completed. Her eyes went straight to the kitchen table, to the packet, and her expression tightened for a fraction of a second before she covered it with mild annoyance. She asked whether the board had already served me, and she asked it like she already knew they had. I didn't answer the question. I asked her one instead, because questions shift pressure away from confession. I asked why my name appeared on a complainant statement I never signed. I kept my tone flat, almost bored, because bored is the one emotion Paige couldn't weaponize. Her face froze, then softened into confusion. She said she had no idea what I meant, and she said it too quickly, like she had rehearsed the denial, but forgot to breathe between words. I watched her carefully, not with jealousy, but with the same attention I'd use for a bad magician. Her eyes flicked to the signature line and stayed there just long enough to reveal recognition. It wasn't shock. It was assessment. She was checking whether the forgery worked. She said Conrad must have made a mistake, and she offered that explanation like a gift she expected me to accept. Then she added that I was being paranoid again, and the word paranoid slid into the air like a knife slipped between ribs. Paige didn't want me to focus on the signature. She wanted me to focus on my own mental state, because that was the narrative she and Conrad had been feeding the building. Unstable husband, angry husband, unsafe husband. Those labels could survive evidence if the crowd loved them enough. I told her I wasn't paranoid. I told her I was documenting. Then I said calmly that I would be asking for the board's document source, delivery chain, and signature verification process in writing. I didn't threaten. I didn't warn. I simply stated what I would do, like I was describing tomorrow's weather. Paige's lips pressed together, and her eyes sharpened. She said I was making things worse, and she said it with the same smug confidence she had used when she told me I learned my lesson. Then she added, almost casually, that if I kept escalating, the board could revoke my access privileges and consider further steps for community safety. She wanted me to imagine losing my home, losing my key fob, being treated like a criminal without the inconvenience of real criminal law. I nodded once, and I asked her whether she had been meeting Conrad during her airwalks. The question was simple and direct, and it hit her harder than any insult. Her reaction wasn't outrage. It was a tiny flinch, the kind that happens when someone hears their secret named with the wrong amount of calm. Then she recovered and said she didn't owe me explanations, which was true, and also irrelevant. I let that sit for a second, then I said something that made her blink. I said she didn't owe me explanations, but she did owe the building the truth if she was using policy to punish a marriage. I watched her face change as she realized what I was doing. I wasn't chasing her. I wasn't begging her. I was separating the marriage from the public record, and that separation threatened the only weapon she still had: control of the narrative. She stepped closer, voice low, and told me I should stop before I embarrassed myself. Embarrassed myself. Not hurt myself, not ruin us, not damage the relationship, embarrass myself. That told me exactly what she cared about. Paige didn't fear being caught. She feared being seen. I picked up the packet and tapped the forged signature line with one finger. Then I placed it back down carefully. I told her this was no longer about feelings. I told her it was about written claims, and written claims have consequences. Then I walked past her and went into the bedroom, not to retreat, but to remove myself from the room before she could provoke a scene. In the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. I created a new entry in my evidence folder and labeled it with the date and a simple phrase, HOA packet with forged signature. Then I added the courier still frame, the packet photos, and a note of Paige's reaction, written in plain language, not interpretation. I did it because I had learned the most important truth of the month. She starved me with silence. The person who controls the record controls the outcome. When I returned to the kitchen, Paige was gone. She had left without using the front door, and the doorbell log proved it. She had slipped out through the side hall again, the same route she used when she wanted control without witnesses. I watched the clip, saved the still frame, and wrote the time on my legal pad. Then my phone buzzed with a new notification, not from the doorbell, but from the HOA group email address. The subject line was short, confident, and designed to sound final: immediate access review and key audit schedule. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the building's walls tighten around the story they were trying to force on me. And then I noticed the sender list, because details are where lies fail. Conrad had copied the entire board, the concierge desk, and one extra address I had never seen before, an external vendor account that ended in secure services. The security contractor was not a rumor anymore. It was an invoice waiting to be questioned. I saved the email header, printed it, signed the back, and realized Paige and Conrad had made the same mistake every bully makes when they get excited. They escalated too fast, and they put too many names on the record. Now I had a new question that didn't feel like curiosity at all. Why would an HOA need a key audit with an outside security vendor unless they were preparing to lock someone out on purpose? The access review email sat in my inbox like a dare written in corporate font, and the worst part was how many people it copied as if humiliation was an acceptable delivery method. Conrad had dressed it up as routine, but the word audit isn't used when everything is fine, and it isn't used when you want peace. It is used when you want control, and you want it quickly. The external vendor address, the one tagged as secure services, was the tell that made my stomach tighten, because the board was building a stage big enough to justify force without ever calling it force. I printed the email, signed the back with the date, and placed it in the sleeve with the forged complaint packet. I didn't add a speech bubble or a dramatic note. I simply stacked facts the way you stack bricks, because you only build walls when you expect someone to push. Then I opened my doorbell app and watched the corridor for a full minute, because I wanted to know whether Paige had returned yet. The feed showed nothing, which meant she was still out there, in the side corridor ecosystem, getting coached or coordinating or both. I left the apartment and walked down to the lobby with the same posture I used when I was late for nothing. The first rule in a building like this is that you never let the building smell fear, because fear becomes gossip, and gossip becomes policy. The second rule is that you always look like you belong, even when someone is quietly trying to unbelong you. I nodded at the concierge and asked casually whether the board had posted details about the key audit schedule. My voice was flat and polite, like I was asking about elevator maintenance. The concierge looked uncomfortable, and that discomfort was an answer before words ever arrived. He said the board planned to put a notice up later, and he said Conrad requested that residents cooperate fully. Cooperate fully was the kind of phrase that gets used when you want obedience more than clarity. I thanked him and glanced at the lobby board. Nothing new was posted yet, just the old community conduct reminder still hanging there like a warning label on my face. Behind me, a pair of residents stepped into the lobby and lowered their voices the second they saw me. I caught fragments, not full sentences, because whispers don't respect completeness. I heard the word unsafe again, and I heard my floor mentioned, and I heard a soft laugh that sounded like relief that the drama belonged to someone else. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was the casual cruelty of spectators who think they are morally involved because they are emotionally entertained. I walked toward the mailroom and found Mina sorting envelopes with the tight shoulders of someone trying not to care. She looked up and gave me a small, tired nod, the kind that says, I saw what you saw, and I also hate it. I asked her quietly whether she had heard anything about the key audit. Mina exhaled like she had been holding her breath since the incident review meeting. She said Conrad had been telling people it was about security integrity, and she said the security vendor would be present in the lobby during certain hours to verify access devices. Verify access devices. That translated to a group of strangers in branded polos standing in public, asking residents to hand over key fobs like schoolchildren surrendering contraband. It wasn't illegal, but it was aggressive in a bureaucratic way, which is how men like Conrad do violence without bruises. Mina added that Paige had been talking in the lobby yesterday, smiling and nodding with Conrad, and she had looked pleased, like she had been promoted. I didn't ask Mina for more details because I refused to turn her into my private investigator. Instead, I asked one boring, practical question that mattered. I asked whether she knew who the board secretary was, the person who recorded minutes and handled document custody. Mina told me the name, a woman named Judith Hale, and she said Judith hated conflict but loved procedure. That was useful, because procedure is the language I planned to speak until the building stopped misusing it. I went back upstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and drafted a simple email to Judith using the HOA address listed on the notice. I kept it short and cold, because long emails look emotional, and emotion is what Paige and Conrad wanted to mine. I requested, in writing, the full incident file referenced by the notice, including the chain of custody for any signature attributed to me. I requested the policy section authorizing a key audit conducted by an external vendor. I requested the criteria used to label an incident as unsafe, and the dates of any reported disturbances. I did not accuse anyone of forging anything. I simply asked for records and policy lines, because those are harder to twist without lying on paper. After sending it, I printed the email and saved the sent confirmation screen on my phone. Then I placed the printout in my sleeve and labeled it with the date. It wasn't dramatic, and that was the point. The building expected me to rant. I was writing receipts. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from Paige that read like a trap dressed as civility. She said we needed to talk before things got worse, and she said she didn't want the board to have to take steps. Have to take steps was her favorite phrasing lately, because it made consequences sound like weather. I stared at the message long enough to feel the old urge to explain myself rise like acid, then I let it pass. Explanations were her fuel. Silence, on my terms, was my new weapon. That afternoon, the first stage of the key audit began, and I didn't need to be told because the lobby changed its posture. When I stepped out of the elevator, I saw two men near the front desk wearing matching shirts with the Secure Services logo. They stood beside a folding table and a small printer, and they smiled at residents as if they were running a charity booth. Conrad stood nearby with Judith and another board member, looking proud of his production. Paige was there too, dressed neutral again, arms folded in a way that looked like patience but felt like victory. Conrad called my name with a careful tone that was meant to sound respectful. He said the key audit would be quick, and he invited me to cooperate. Several residents had paused in the lobby, pretending to check mail while actually watching, because nothing draws people like a controlled humiliation. Paige looked at me with a small smirk that she tried to hide, and the smirk told me she believed this was her moment. I stepped forward and asked politely whether I could see the policy authorization for the audit. I didn't say it loudly, and I didn't say it like a challenge. I said it like a normal adult, asking why strangers were being allowed to handle access control. Conrad's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. He said the board had the authority to ensure building security, and he said residents were required to comply. Required. There was that word again, wielded like a stamp. I nodded and asked for the specific policy line, not a summary. Judith shifted slightly, and I could see discomfort in the way she held her clipboard because she knew policy lines exist to be quoted, not paraphrased. Conrad tried to redirect by asking for my key fob, implying I was delaying and being difficult. I held my key fob in my hand but didn't hand it over. I said I would comply once I saw the policy line and once the vendor identified the scope of the data they planned to record. The secure services technician cleared his throat and said they only recorded fob serial numbers and validity status, and he said it with the mild boredom of a man who didn't want drama. That was fine, and I could work with that. I asked whether the technician could provide a receipt of the audit action taken on my fob, including time and result. Receipt was the magic word, because receipts change behavior. The technician glanced at Conrad, and that glance was another answer without words. Conrad's tone sharpened just slightly as he said receipts were not necessary, and that my refusal would be noted. Noted. Conrad loved documentation when it was his documentation. I smiled briefly and told him I also liked documentation, which was why I had asked for a receipt. Then I asked Judith directly whether the minutes would reflect that I requested the policy line and a receipt, and that the board declined to provide both. Judith blinked, and the room held its breath for a moment, because now it wasn't about me and Paige. It was about the board's process, and process makes witnesses nervous when it gets questioned in public. Judith said she would note the request. Conrad's jaw tightened, and Paige's expression flickered, because she hadn't predicted a conflict framed as procedural fairness. She wanted me to look unstable, not careful. The technician shifted uncomfortably and said he could print a simple receipt if allowed. Conrad cut him off with a quick smile and said it wasn't needed. Then Conrad tried a new angle, saying my behavior was exactly why the audit was necessary. That was the narrative hook Paige wanted, the board taking steps because of my tone. I didn't take the bait. I simply asked Conrad whether he was labeling my request for policy as non-compliance, and if so, which rule defined that. Conrad looked toward the other board member, and that board member looked away, because cowardice is contagious in committees. Paige stepped forward slightly, then stopped herself, realizing any visible involvement would contaminate her innocent resident posture. In that pause, I saw the first tiny crack in their coordination. They had rehearsed intimidation, but they hadn't rehearsed calm resistance. Judith spoke again, voice careful, and said she could retrieve the policy binder from the office if it would help. Conrad's smile turned brittle, but he nodded, because refusing would look worse now. Judith walked toward the back hallway, and the lobby's audience shifted again, because the show had changed from marital drama to governance friction. People love governance friction because it makes them feel like citizens. While Judith was gone, I held my key fob and watched Paige. Her face was composed, but the muscle near her mouth kept tightening and releasing, as if she was chewing something bitter. Conrad tried to fill the silence with small talk about security, but the silence ate his words. The technician stared at the floor like a man regretting his hourly rate. Judith returned with a binder and opened it on the table. She flipped to a section and pointed to a paragraph that authorized audits under certain conditions, and those conditions were not vague. They required documented incidents with dates, and they required written notice specifying scope and retention. Conrad tried to summarize it quickly, but Judith kept her finger on the page like a line of truth pinned down. The audience leaned in. I asked to photograph the policy paragraph for my records because it was posted to residents in a meeting, and that made it fair game. Conrad started to object, then stopped when Judith nodded. I took a clear photo with the timestamp visible. Then I handed my key fob to the technician and asked for a receipt showing time and status. The technician printed it without drama. Conrad watched, jaw set as if paper had just insulted him. The receipt printed, and the technician handed it to me. It showed my fob was valid, no issues. Valid. That word mattered, because it stripped the audit of its implied target. I thanked the technician, pocketed the receipt, and looked at Conrad with the same calm I'd used all month. I said I was glad the audit confirmed my access was normal. Then I added politely that I would still be awaiting the full incident file and signature custody explanation in writing. Paige's eyes narrowed, because now the lobby had witnessed something she couldn't twist easily. I hadn't refused, I hadn't shouted, I hadn't threatened. I had complied under policy and demanded documentation, and the building watched Conrad hesitate. For the first time in weeks, the lobby didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a meeting where the chair had lost control. As I walked back toward the elevator, I heard two residents whisper, not about my temper, but about Conrad. That was the shift I needed, the first small inversion in the building's gossip current. Paige called my name softly, like she wanted a private moment, and I didn't turn. Private moments were where she rewrote reality. I wasn't giving her that room again. Inside the elevator, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from Judith, and the subject line was short and careful, like a person trying not to get fired. Incident file request acknowledged, document review scheduled. I stared at the words and felt the next layer of the operation reveal itself. They weren't just auditing keys anymore. They were scheduling a review, a controlled room with controlled minutes, where they would try to turn my requests into proof of my pattern. And if Judith was scheduling it, then Conrad was preparing a formal setting where Paige could play innocent, and I could be labeled difficult again. The worst part was the meeting location listed in the preview line. The community room, same as before, but this time with security present. Judith's email looked polite on the surface, but every word carried a small flinch, as if she knew she was stepping between a chair and the legs it liked to kick. She confirmed a document review in the community room, and she mentioned security presence as if it were a neutral detail, like coffee would be provided. Security presence meant Conrad wanted witnesses for my non-compliance, and he wanted muscle to make the room feel dangerous before anyone spoke. I printed Judith's email, signed the back, and slid it into the sleeve with the forged packet and the key audit receipt. The sleeve was getting thick now, not with drama, but with boring proof, and boring proof is the only kind that survives committees. Then I did the one thing Conrad never expected from a man he was trying to paint as unstable. I prepared like a clerk, not like a husband. I made a one-page table on paper, date place payment, because narratives hate tables. In the first column, I listed the HOA meeting date, the courier delivery date, and the key audit timestamp. In the second column, I listed where it happened: community room, my doorway, lobby table. In the third column, I listed what was claimed about me: unsafe, non-compliant, disruptive. In the last column, I listed what the documents actually proved: mandatory language without incident specifics, forged signature attempt, audit confirming valid access. It looked dull, which was perfect, because dull is what you want when the other side is selling fear. Before I left the apartment, I did a quick public search on the Secure Services name, because curiosity is only illegal when you force it. The company had a thin website with stock photos and a phone number, and it listed an owner name that matched Conrad's last name. It could have been a coincidence, but coincidences like that are usually the lazy cousin of corruption. I saved the public page screenshot, then I saved the business listing page where the owner name appeared again, and I wrote a single note beside it on my legal pad. Vendor conflict of interest possibility. Verify in meeting. Do not accuse without record. Paige was home when I finished, sitting on the couch with her phone angled low, and she didn't look up when I passed. She was performing calm now, because she had learned that obvious hostility made her look like the aggressor. When I reached the door, she finally spoke in the soft, sweet voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable to an invisible audience. She asked if I was going to embarrass us again. The word embarrass landed harder than any insult, because it proved she still thought the building was the real marriage. I didn't answer her, because answers were her raw material. I simply told her I was attending a document review, and I said it like I was going to the pharmacy. Paige's mouth tightened, then she forced a small smile, the kind people wear when they think the ending is already written. She reminded me, gently, that security would be there, as if she cared about my comfort. I nodded once and left, letting the door close on her performance. The hallway outside already felt staged. 2 residents hovered near the elevator pretending to check their phones, then looked up the second I stepped out. They smiled too quickly, like witnesses trying to be neutral, and the neutrality looked guilty. When the elevator doors opened, I rode down alone, watching the floor numbers tick like a countdown the building insisted on making public. In the lobby, the secure services men were back, standing near the community room door like they were guarding a vault. Conrad stood beside them in his blazer, talking with 2 board members, and his posture had the confident stiffness of a man who believed policy made him untouchable. Paige was there too, sitting on a chair near the wall with her arms folded, looking like an injured party who had shown up anyway because she was brave. Judith stood near the table inside the room, holding a binder and a stamp pad, and she looked like a woman who wished she could melt into the drywall. Conrad greeted me with that careful smile again, the one designed for people who might later be called as witnesses. He said this was a simple review, and that cooperation would be noted. He always said, "noted," like he was doing me a favor. One of the security men stepped slightly into my path, not aggressively, just enough to communicate that the room was now conditional. Conrad didn't order him, but he didn't stop him either, which was the point. Conrad wanted the room to feel like a checkpoint. I asked calmly whether the security vendor was acting under HOA authority or under Conrad's personal direction. The question wasn't dramatic, but it forced a frame. Conrad's smile twitched, and he said the board had retained the vendor for community safety. Community safety was his favorite perfume. I nodded and asked Judith to confirm the vendor retention vote date and whether it was recorded in minutes. I asked it like a procedural detail, because that's what it was, and the room fell quiet in the way it does when procedure enters. Judith cleared her throat and said the retention was approved, but she did not immediately cite a vote date. That hesitation mattered, because Judith was the type who knew dates when things were clean. Conrad stepped in and tried to redirect, telling Judith to begin the review, and he said it like a chair calling a meeting to order. The board members behind him shifted uncomfortably, because they could feel the spotlight moving away from me and toward their own paperwork. Judith opened with the incident file, and she slid a copy of the complaint packet across the table toward me. This copy was cleaner than the one delivered to my door, as if someone had tried to sanitize it for the record. I placed my own packet beside it, opened both to the complainant statement section, and aligned the pages so anyone could see the signature line. Then I pointed to my name typed beneath the handwriting and asked in a calm voice for the chain of custody for that signature. Conrad's jaw tightened again, and he said it was an administrative error that would be corrected. Administrative error was the phrase people use when they want you to stop asking questions. I didn't argue. I asked who completed the signature line, who entered it into the file, and when. I said I wanted those answers in the minutes. Then I looked at Judith, not Conrad, because Judith was the recorder, and Conrad was only a man who loved hearing himself talk. Judith glanced at Conrad, then back to the paper, and I watched her swallow. She said she would note the question and request documentation of the signature source. Conrad immediately tried to reframe it as a misunderstanding, saying I had acknowledged receipt in some way. I slid the courier doorbell still frame toward Judith, along with the photo of the unopened envelope beside my phone time display. I said I accepted delivery but declined to sign anything in the hallway. I asked Judith to stamp my copy of that still frame as received into the file. The room shifted again, because stamps change behavior. Judith hesitated for a second, then reached for the stamp and pressed it onto the corner of the page, received, date, initialed. That stamp was small, but it was a weight, because now my evidence wasn't just mine, it was in their file. Conrad watched Judith stamp it, and his smile looked like it might crack. Paige finally spoke from the wall, voice soft, as if she hated conflict. She said she felt unsafe and that the board was only trying to protect residents. She didn't mention the forged signature, and she didn't mention the courier, and she didn't mention the key audit receipt showing my access was valid. She spoke as if feelings were facts, because in buildings like this, feelings often are. I kept my eyes on the paper and asked Paige, without raising my voice, whether she had submitted the complainant statement herself. I didn't accuse her of forging anything. I asked a simple yes or no question about submission. Paige's face tightened, and she said she didn't know what I was talking about, and she said it too smoothly. Then she added that my tone was exactly the problem. Tone. She always tried to drag everything back into the emotional swamp where she could swim. Conrad tried to step in again, but Judith surprised him by asking Paige whether she had emailed any draft complaint language to the board. Judith's voice was careful, but the question was sharp, and it landed like a pin. Paige blinked, and for a second, she looked like a person who hadn't rehearsed that angle. She said she had shared concerns by email, but that she didn't fill out anything formal. It was a half-truth, shaped like a shield. Judith turned a page in the file and paused, finger resting on a printed email header. She didn't announce it, but the room saw her pause, and I saw the flicker in Conrad's eyes that suggested he recognized the header too. Judith said quietly that the complainant statement text appeared to have originated from an email attachment sent from Paige's address. She said she needed to verify it, but that was the preliminary record. Paige's posture stiffened, and Conrad's face tightened into something colder than his normal smile. The mid-story truth hit the room without a speech. Paige wasn't just a concerned resident. Paige was a source document. The building's narrative wasn't floating gossip anymore. It had a sender line. Paige recovered quickly, because she always did, and she said Conrad must have used her words to draft something without her consent. She tried to paint herself as a victim of Conrad's administration, which was clever, because it created distance between her and the forgery, while still keeping the target on me. Conrad didn't deny it directly. He said he had compiled concerns, and that the board had authority to document. Authority, again. Always authority. Never responsibility. I didn't argue with either of them. I asked Judith to note in minutes that the complaint language originated from Paige's attachment, and that the signature line was not authored by me. Then I slid my public screenshots of the secure services listing across the table, not as an accusation, but as a question. I asked whether the board had disclosed any relationship between Conrad and the vendor, because the owner name matched his. I asked whether that relationship had been disclosed in the retention process and whether the minutes reflected it. Conrad's smile returned, but it looked strained now, and he said the vendor relationship was irrelevant to the complaint. That was an answer that didn't answer. Judith glanced at the board members, and one of them looked at the floor like he had dropped something expensive. The secure services technician shifted his feet and looked like he regretted being a character in someone else's marriage. Judith said carefully that vendor disclosure rules existed and that she would need to check whether a conflict disclosure was filed. Conrad tried to end the review then, saying the board would take everything under advisement. Under advisement was his polite way of saying, "Shut up." I nodded and asked for one final procedural thing, a receipt that my documents were entered into the incident file. Judith stamped the corner of my one-page table and initialed it again. Then she typed a short line into the minutes draft on her laptop, visible enough that I could see the phrase "evidence received" before Conrad angled his body to block it. Paige watched me with a new kind of expression now, less smug and more calculating. The smirk she loved wasn't working, because the room had watched her attachment become a source, and they had watched Conrad flinch at a disclosure question. She hadn't expected procedure to turn on her. She had expected emotion. As the meeting dissolved into awkward politeness, Conrad stepped closer to me and lowered his voice, trying to regain private leverage without witnesses. He said softly that there were easier ways to handle marital issues and that the board would not tolerate being used as a battlefield. I nodded once and told him I agreed, which was why I wanted the board out of my marriage and my marriage out of the board's record. Then I walked away, leaving him standing with his vendor and his binder, looking like a man who had been forced to show his hands too early. In the lobby, Mina stood near the mailboxes, pretending to sort letters while watching everything. She caught my eye and gave me a tiny nod, the kind that says the current is shifting, even if it is slow. I stepped toward the elevator, and my phone buzzed with a message from Paige that arrived so quickly it felt pre-written. She said we needed to talk tonight, and she said we should do it somewhere public so I couldn't twist it later. Public. Of course she wanted public now, because she had just lost control of the record in the community room. She wanted a new stage where she could recover the audience with performance. I stared at her message, then at the lobby where Conrad was already whispering to a board member, and I realized something sharper than suspicion. They weren't trying to end the conflict. They were trying to relocate it to a stage they could control. And the next stage was going to have more than building residents watching. By the time I reached my floor, Paige's message was already starting to grow legs in the building's imagination. Public talk, she wrote, like she was offering me fairness instead of another trap. She didn't want resolution, and she didn't want truth. She wanted a room where her face could be proof and my restraint could be framed as menace. A stage with witnesses who only heard tone, not facts. I didn't respond right away. I stood in my kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum, because even the appliances sounded like they were waiting for a verdict. Then I opened my sleeve, spread the stamped documents across the table, and looked at the pattern the way I always should have. Paige wasn't improvising. Conrad wasn't improvising. They were running a script, and the script depended on one thing: nobody demanding a clean record. Judith's stamped received marks were the first nails in that script's coffin, but nails alone don't end a performance. You need a spotlight shift, a moment where the audience realizes they have been cheering for the wrong villain. That kind of shift doesn't come from shouting, and it doesn't come from pleading. It comes from a neutral page that makes denial look childish. I checked the HOA resident portal, the one the board liked to use when they wanted to look transparent without being questioned. The portal had a monthly spending summary, and it wasn't hidden or privileged. It was the kind of public accountability document residents could view, the board's idea of openness. I clicked into the vendor list and found secure services. There it was, neat as a gravestone. Vendor name, service description, and payment lines that matched the week Conrad started talking about safety like it was a religion. I took a screenshot of the vendor line item and saved it with the date visible. Then I opened the attached invoice PDF because the portal allowed it, and because Conrad had clearly assumed nobody would care. The invoice header showed the vendor's registered address and the contact name. The contact name matched Conrad's last name again, and this time it wasn't a search result. It was on the HOA's own record. I saved the invoice header screenshot and printed it because digital proof is fragile when people start having trouble accessing the portal. I wasn't done. I checked the HOA meeting agenda posted for next week, and my stomach tightened when I saw the wording. Special session, access integrity and resident conduct review. My name wasn't written, but my life was. Under Agenda Item 3, it listed Committee Vote on Continued Vendor Retention and Authorization for Further Access Control Measures. Conrad was preparing to lock me out in a way that would sound like the building was protecting itself, and if he succeeded, Paige would get what she wanted without ever asking for it directly. I took a screenshot of the agenda and saved it with the time. Then I printed it and signed the back like everything else. I was building a trail that didn't care about charm. Paige came back an hour later, and she moved through the apartment as if she was already the rightful owner of the silence. She didn't ask whether I was okay. She didn't ask what I wanted. She asked whether I had decided where we would talk in public. She said it with a calm, almost playful voice, like she was offering me a chance to redeem myself in front of the building. I watched her face and kept mine blank. I told her we could talk in the lobby cafe area near the mailboxes because it was public enough to satisfy her and controlled enough to keep her from building a theatrical crowd. She smiled, and the smile was too quick, too relieved. She thought she had won something. We went downstairs early before the residents returned from work in a wave, and she chose a table where the concierge desk could see us clearly. She wanted the front desk's eyes on me because that gave her safety optics. She didn't order coffee. She didn't order anything. She sat like a witness, waiting for the suspect to speak first. She started by describing how hard the past month had been for her, and she framed the silent treatment like a necessary boundary instead of a weapon. She said she had needed to teach me how to respect her space. Respect. Lesson. The same words, always the same words. She wanted to repeat them in public so they could become communal truth. I didn't argue about feelings. Arguing about feelings is like wrestling fog. I asked her quietly why her email attachment was in the incident file as the source text for the complaint statement. I didn't raise my voice and I didn't call her a liar. I simply asked a factual question about a factual record. Paige's eyes flicked away for half a second, then returned with an expression of injured disbelief. She said Conrad had used her words without her consent, and she said she was shocked by it. Shocked. Her acting was good enough for people who didn't want to look at her hands. I nodded and said I was glad she saw it as wrong because it meant she would support correcting the record in writing. I said I would forward her a simple statement for her to sign, clarifying that she did not submit any signature or authorization on my behalf. I watched her face tighten at the word sign. Paige liked signatures when they were mine, not hers. She told me she didn't need to sign anything, and she said the board could handle it. That was the crack. The crack was always the same. People who thrive on narrative hate committing to a clean sentence. I leaned back and looked past her shoulder at the mailroom, where Mina was sorting letters again, pretending not to listen. The concierge glanced up once, then looked away. The building was watching in fragments. I needed the fragments to assemble into one simple image. Paige refusing accountability while demanding obedience. I told Paige something else, still calm, still factual. I told her the HOA portal listed secure services invoices under Conrad's contact name. I said I had printed the invoice header. I did not accuse her of knowing. I did not accuse Conrad of fraud. I simply stated what the building's own documents showed. For the first time, Paige looked genuinely unsettled, not because she cared about ethics, but because she understood what it meant when the villain got paperwork. She asked where I got that information, and her voice sharpened despite her attempt to keep it sweet. I told her it was on the resident portal, under spending summaries. Then I added that the agenda for the special session included a vote on vendor retention and access control measures, and I asked whether she planned to speak in favor of locking me out. Paige's posture shifted, and she leaned forward like she was trying to turn the conversation into intimacy, into something private again. She said I was making everything worse, and she said I was obsessed with paperwork. She said I was punishing her for needing space. The old gaslight pattern, dressed as concern. I didn't take the bait. I said the only thing I cared about now was the record, because the record was what she and Conrad had been using to hurt me without consequences. Then I said I would be attending the special session with a binder of stamped documents, and I would be asking the board secretary to type "evidence received" into the minutes while the room watched. I didn't say it as a threat. I said it like the weather again because inevitability scares bullies more than anger does. Paige stared at me, and the smirk she loved tried to appear, then failed. She told me softly that if I pushed the board too hard, they could take serious steps. Steps. always steps. She still believed the committee could erase me like a stain. I said I had learned my lesson, and I said it with the same quiet certainty she had used when she thought she owned the phrase. I said I learned that marriage was the easiest place to be punished because it happens behind closed doors and everyone assumes it is private. I said I was done letting private harm become public policy. Paige's eyes flashed, and she stood up abruptly, chair scraping the floor hard enough to draw a glance from the concierge. She said this was why she needed distance, and she said she was afraid of what I would do next. Afraid. There it was again, the word she wanted planted in the lobby like a warning sign. I didn't move, I didn't follow, I didn't reach for her arm. I watched her walk away toward the side corridor exit, and I let the doorbell log handle the rest of the truth. When she disappeared, Mina finally looked up and met my eyes for a second, and in that second, I saw something that wasn't pity. It was recognition. I went back upstairs and found an email from Judith waiting for me, sent only minutes after the cafe encounter, which meant Conrad had already been talking. The subject line was short and severe: special session procedure and submission deadline. Judith wrote that any documents to be considered must be submitted 24 hours before the session for inclusion in the minutes packet. She said it like a warning, but I read it like an opening, because if there was a submission deadline, there was also a submission receipt. And if Judith was forced to build a packet, she was also forced to log what she received and when. Conrad's power depended on controlling the packet. My power depended on forcing the packet to become honest. I assembled the binder that night with a calm that felt almost surgical. The forged signature page, my delivery still frame, the key audit receipt showing valid access, the policy paragraph photograph, the HOA agenda screenshot, and the secure services invoice header showing Conrad's contact name. I added a one-page table that tied each item to a date and a plain claim. I didn't add opinions. I didn't add insults. I added gravity. Then I drafted a cover letter addressed to the board, written in simple lines, asking for 3 things: immediate correction of the incident file, formal disclosure of any conflict of interest tied to secure services, and suspension of any access control measures until the record was verified. I requested that the letter and attachments be entered into minutes as received. At midnight, my phone buzzed with a new notification from the resident portal. The board had quietly updated the special session location. It had been moved from the community room to the HOA clubhouse hearing space on the ground floor, a room designed for witnesses, with a projector and a lectern, and the kind of seating that makes every head turn toward the speaker. Conrad wasn't just planning a meeting, he was planning a public verdict, and now I knew exactly how I was going to make that verdict backfire. The HOA clubhouse hearing space smelled like stale coffee and carpet shampoo, which was fitting for a room built to sanitize conflict. A projector hung from the ceiling like a single unblinking eye, and the lectern stood at the front with a microphone nobody needed to raise. Chairs were set in neat rows, angled to force every face toward the center, because committees love geometry that makes people behave. Conrad arrived early, of course, wearing his blazer like a badge and shaking hands like he owned the building's oxygen. The secure services technicians were posted by the doors again, not blocking anyone outright, just existing loudly enough to make the room feel conditional. Paige sat in the second row with her legs crossed, posture calm, expression soft, the kind of softness that plays well in public when you are secretly holding a knife by the handle. Judith sat at the long table beside the board members, her laptop open, her stamp pad ready, and her eyes a little too tired for a woman who still believed procedure was a shield. I took a seat near the aisle where I could stand without squeezing past people, because I was done apologizing with my body. In my lap, I held the binder, thick with paper that had no emotions and no excuses. Conrad called the session to order, with the cheerful tone of a man convinced that order was the same thing as truth. He framed the meeting as a safety and access integrity review, and he referenced patterns without giving the pattern the courtesy of dates. He mentioned resident discomfort, and he glanced toward Paige just long enough for the room to understand who the star witness was supposed to be. Paige spoke first, which was the plan. She described the past month as a necessary boundary, and she described herself as patient, and she described me as reactive, without ever using the word reactive. Her voice stayed smooth and careful, and the smoothness made people lean in, because audiences trust a calm voice more than a clean record. She said she wanted peace, and she said she wanted safety, and she said she hoped the board would take steps. Steps. Always steps. Always the implication that the building could punish a marriage into obedience. Conrad thanked her in the tone that suggested he was awarding points. Then he looked toward me and asked whether I had anything to add. The room waited, and that was their first mistake. Waiting assumes spectacle. I didn't give them spectacle. I stood, carried my binder to the table, and asked Judith calmly to mark my submission as received into the minutes packet. I did not ask Conrad. I asked the person who controlled the record. Judith's eyes flicked to Conrad, then back to me, and I watched her wrestle with the fear of being yelled at versus the relief of following rules. I placed the binder on the table, opened to the cover page, and slid it toward Judith. The cover page was a one-page table, date, place, claim proof, written in plain language and printed in clean lines. I kept my voice flat as I stated the only thing that mattered. I said I was submitting documents for the record, and I requested that the minutes reflect evidence received with the timestamp of submission. Conrad tried to interrupt by saying the submission deadline had passed, but Judith checked the clock and said carefully that it was still within the window. The secure services technician near the door shifted his stance, as if unsure whether he was there to protect the building or protect Conrad's pride. The room leaned forward, because this was now a procedural contest, and procedural contests feel like justice to people who don't want to choose sides. Judith stamped the first page, received, date, and her initials. Then she typed a line into her laptop. I couldn't read the whole sentence from where I stood, but I saw the word received appear, and that was enough. Records do not care who smiles better. Conrad regained his posture and told the board they had reviewed my prior complaints, and that the board's focus was safety, not marital issues. That was almost funny, because my marriage had been the board's favorite hobby for weeks. I nodded once and said I agreed, which was why my submission addressed board process, vendor conflict, and document integrity, not feelings. Then I opened the binder to the forged signature page and placed it beside the clean file copy Judith had in front of her. I pointed to the complainant statement signature line with my name typed under handwriting that wasn't mine. I did not accuse anyone directly. I asked, plainly, for the chain of custody of that signature and the identity of the person who entered it into the file. Paige's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, and Conrad's smile held while his eyes hardened. He called it an administrative error again, but administrative errors do not usually mimic a signature. I asked Judith whether the minutes would record that the signature was disputed and that the source was unknown at this time. Judith's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then she typed. Conrad's voice sharpened as he insisted the board should move forward. I turned one page and placed the doorbell delivery still frame on the table, timestamp visible, envelope visible, showing the courier and my doorway. I placed the photo of the unopened envelope beside my phone time display next to it. I said the record proved delivery acceptance and proved I refused to sign in the hallway. I asked that those items be entered into the file as supporting documentation. Judith stamped them again. The stamp sounded loud in that room because stamps are a kind of public truth. Paige tried to pivot by describing her fear, the way she had practiced, but her fear now had to compete with paper. Paper is not sympathetic, and that is why it works. I did not respond to her emotions. I moved to the next section of the binder and placed Judith's earlier stamped policy paragraph photo on the table, the one authorizing audits under documented conditions. I said the policy required incident dates and scope notice and retention rules, and I asked Conrad to identify the documented incidents that triggered the key audit. Conrad started to speak in generalities, but one of the board members, a man who had been nodding along all night, asked quietly whether there were incident dates in the file. The question was soft, but it changed the temperature. Conrad's authority depended on nobody asking boring questions. Judith flipped through the incident file and hesitated, and that hesitation was a confession in slow motion. She said the file contained resident concerns but lacked clear incident timestamps. Conrad's jaw tightened, and Paige's posture stiffened because their script assumed the file would look complete enough to scare people away from curiosity. I turned to the vendor section, because curiosity was exactly what I was there to force. I placed the HOA resident portal spending screenshot on the table, showing secure services line items. I placed the invoice header behind it, with the contact name visible, matching Conrad's last name. Then I asked one clean question that did not require a speech. I asked whether Conrad had disclosed a relationship to the vendor as required by board ethics rules. The room went quiet in a different way now, not entertained quiet, but careful quiet. The quiet people use when they realize they might have approved something ugly without reading the fine print. Conrad laughed lightly, the kind of laugh meant to dismiss the question as absurd. He said there was no conflict, and he said the vendor was selected for safety. I nodded and asked whether he would consent to the minutes recording that he denied a conflict, despite the invoice listing his surname as vendor contact. I watched the board members glance at one another, and I watched Paige's face tighten as she realized she couldn't smirk her way out of a procurement question. Judith, still trying to be neutral, asked Conrad if he had filed a disclosure form. Conrad hesitated just long enough to make his denial look less like confidence and more like calculation. He said disclosures were handled informally and that the vendor was a community choice. Informal, another word people use when they know a form would hurt them. A board member asked to see the invoice header. I slid it across without drama. The board member read it, eyes narrowing, and then asked Judith whether vendor retention votes were recorded. Judith answered that they were, and she looked suddenly nervous, because now her minutes mattered to someone besides Conrad. Paige tried to regain the room by saying she didn't care about vendors and only wanted safety. She leaned into the wounded resident tone again, hoping the audience would return to feelings. I looked at her, not with rage, but with the calm of a man who finally understood her favorite trick. I asked Paige whether she would sign a one-sentence correction, stating she did not authorize any signature on my behalf and that her email attachment was used without consent. I asked it politely, because polite questions create brutal answers. Paige said she didn't need to sign anything. She said the board could handle it. She said it like a refusal was strength. Judith typed something again, her face tight. Conrad tried to end the session, but the room had shifted. The board member who held the invoice asked whether the board could pause any access control measures until the vendor conflict was clarified and the incident file was verified. Another board member agreed, voice quiet, because quiet agreement is the first sign of a committee turning on its chair. Conrad's hands tightened on his binder, and his smile looked like it might crack from the effort. Judith suggested a formal motion, because she could sense where this was going, and she wanted it to be procedural instead of chaotic. The board member made the motion to suspend secure services retention pending disclosure review, and to freeze any access control steps related to resident conduct until the complaint file was corrected. Another board member seconded it quickly before Conrad could regain control. Conrad objected, but objections are just sound when a room has paperwork. He argued safety again, but the safety argument now had a vendor invoice stapled to it. Paige looked around, searching faces for support, and found mostly discomfort. Discomfort is the cousin of guilt. Judith asked for a vote, and she typed the motion language into the minutes draft on the projector feed, because the room's system mirrored her screen by default. That was the moment I had been waiting for. the moment when the record stopped being private. The vote happened in raised hands and lowered eyes, and Conrad watched his authority shrink into a tally. The motion passed. Secure Services retention was suspended pending disclosure review. Access control measures were paused, document integrity review was scheduled, and Judith was tasked with verifying the signature source and correcting the incident file. Conrad tried to protest, but one of the board members asked him, directly, to provide his disclosure form within 48 hours. Conrad's mouth opened, then closed again, because even he understood that arguing now would only write more suspicion into the record. Paige stood abruptly, chair-scraping, and said this was unfair and that she was being ignored. She tried to make it emotional again, but the emotion had nowhere to land. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was nodding. The room had moved past her performance and into governance. She glanced at Conrad, and Conrad didn't look back at her because he was now protecting himself. Judith typed one final line into the minutes draft, and the projector displayed it in clean text for everyone to see. Evidence received, motion passed, vendor suspended pending review, access measures paused. I looked at Paige then, and I kept my voice low and clear. I said I had learned my lesson, and the lesson was that punishment disguised as love still counts as punishment. I said I was done with the marriage because it had been turned into a tool for control. Then I placed a plain envelope on the table in front of her, the kind of envelope that does not care about tears or smirks. Paige stared at it, and she knew what it was before she touched it, because she had been waiting for me to beg, not to end. The room watched her hand hover, watched her swallow, watched her look toward Conrad for rescue and find none. The Secure Services technician near the door shifted again, not stepping in, just witnessing, because even hired neutrality has limits when the script collapses. Paige finally reached for the envelope, and Judith's keyboard clicked once more as she recorded the meeting's closing line, because that is what happens when the truth becomes administrative. And as Paige's fingers closed around the paper, the building stopped whispering and started taking notes.